Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always, I'm joined by my co-presenter, John Dorney from theirishstory.com. Please check out our friends at radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes at irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at irishhistorypod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help us, and if you hear an episode you like, please share it on your social media. We are very grateful for all the support we receive from you, the listeners. John has set up a Patreon for the Irish History Show and the Irish Story, and if you would consider supporting the show, there is a link in the show notes. And thank you so much to everyone who has contributed already. On this episode of the show, we are very pleased to be joined by a very special guest, Dr. Spencer Jones, to discuss the Boer War. Dr. Jones is the Senior Lecturer in Armed Forces and War Studies at the University of Wolverhampton and serves as the Regimental Historian for the Royal Regiment of Artillery. His key works include From Boer War to World War, Tactical Reform of the British Army, 1902 to 1914, and Stemming the Tide, Officers and Leadership in the British Expeditionary Force 1914, which was runner-up for the Templar Medal in 2014. In 2018, he was made a Hague Fellow by the Douglas Haig Fellowship in recognition of his contribution to the field of First World War studies. You're very welcome to the show, Spencer.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's an absolute pleasure. I don't often get to talk about the Boer War. I'm more known for my First World War work, including my own podcast, Not So Quiet on the Western Front, which is all about the First World War. So it's a real pleasure to actually go back to 1899 and the war in South Africa.
Yes, and as the point you've made yourself, you really can't truly understand Britain's contribution to the First World War unless you delve back a bit further into the Boer War.
Absolutely not. This is such a pivotal moment in so many ways for Britain. If you'd spoken to a citizen of Britain, or maybe even the British Empire in 1913, and you'd asked them about the war, they'd have automatically assumed you were speaking about the Boer War. That's how significant it was in the English-speaking world. It was the biggest war that the British Empire had fought really since the Napoleonic Wars. It dwarfed the Crimean War in scale and its overall effects. And its influence, its political influence, its military influence, its social influence would be felt for decades to come.
Now, Spencer, what first prompted your interest in the Boer War?
It's a great question because it began in a slightly strange circumstance, and this was with the great book by Thomas Pakenham, which is simply called The Boer War. And from memory, I think it was published in the 1970s, so before I was born. And I had a copy of this from a hospital library. I was actually having a hospital stay about 20 years ago now. Needed something to read, and I picked up a copy of Pakenham's The Boer War. Now, I was very ill at the time, so I didn't necessarily pick up all the details, but I enjoyed it so much, even reading it. I thought, once I'm out of hospital, I need to revisit this. And I did, and I devoured it, really. And it sparked this absolutely huge interest in the Boer War that's never left. I've always been fascinated in this conflict. I've had the real joy and pleasure to spend time in South Africa researching it. I've been able to visit most, although not all, of the battlefields of the war. And to this day, I still say to anybody who's interested in the Boer War, if you want a great place to start, Thomas Pakenham's The Boer War has simply never been bettered, even though there have been many other books that have followed for a narrative that it reads almost like a thriller. Pakenham's The Boer War is the place to start.
Well, Spencer, I couldn't agree more. As we've spoken about off air, I'm a big fan of Thomas Pakenham's book. And just to dwell on it for a second, so Thomas Pakenham is an Anglo-Irish writer from the family of Lord Longford, and his grandfather, I think, served in the war in the Imperial Yeomanry.
That's correct. He did. And that's even what's prompted Thomas Pakenham to begin his interest in Africa, because he wrote The Scramble for Africa too, which is a very, very good book, but perhaps not quite as direct as his Boer War book. And it was that family connection that really drew him to this conflict. And in the 1960s and 70s, there was still just the faintest cultural memory of the Boer War. There was still a handful of people left alive who had actually lived through it. And he sort of, in a way, Pakenham's work marks the full stop as that generation finally passed away, and he could write the definitive history. He had the opportunity to actually interview people who'd fought in the war, and you can see that in his footnotes. And he was probably the last historian to speak to veterans of the Boer War, which is a sort of fascinating bridge from our world in the 21st century to the events of 125 years ago.
Yeah, and like not to get too into Thomas Pakenham and his greatness and so on, but I always thought as well, being from that class, like the class that ran the British Empire once upon a time, he was able to take a very critical but also very knowing look at the people in charge, the likes of Milner and Kitchener and so on, which people today I don't think would have the insight to do.
I agree completely. And this is something I often say to my students. My undergraduate students, as all youngsters do, tend to see that anything that is modern and current as superior to things that have come in the past, can have that linear view of progression. What we lose, and this is a great point you made, John, is what we lose is that connection, that unspoken, unwritten connection to a world that existed before. And I think Pakenham's understanding of how things were really done by that social class, by that officer class in the Boer War is incredibly perceptive, because as we view it through a haze of 125 years, we inevitably suffer a breakdown of the theory of the mind. And we tend to think of these men as thinking like we do. And they didn't. And they did not act in the way that we do. Their worldview was different. Their approach to governance was different. And I agree with you. I think Pakenham understands that. He's from that class and he grew up educated in a system that still saw this as the way to do things. And I think that's what makes so much of his interpretation of the senior figures in this war is unique and is spot on. And other historians, have revised things around him, have challenged certain views, as historians inevitably do. But there's a fundamental truth, I think, to Pakenham that this is in some ways the British Empire at its most powerful and also its most foolish and its most reckless, and it's the war is far from anything to be proud about in either its causes or its conduct. And he understands this. And to publish that in 1979 without denigrating the memory of the soldiers or the combatants, those who fell in the war, is actually quite a unique thing. And I think it adds so much to his book. So one of my absolute favorites.
Yeah, finally on this. Now we could talk all night about Pakenham and the writing about the war, but like I do get the impression also that Pakenham's background as an actual aristocrat, landed aristocrat from Ireland, whose father, by the way, was also a historian, wrote a very good book about the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921. But I digress. But I mean, he gives him sympathy for Redvers Buller, who was a man of a similar class who commanded the British Army in South Africa, but who was widely pilloried at the time. Whereas the likes of Milner, who was the chief kind of civil servant at the time, comes across from the book as a very unsympathetic character. I think my feelings on that might have been influenced perhaps by Pakenham in his own background.
I think so. I think that Pakenham's background too. It has an understanding, I think, of. It's mentioned that the leaves of power. And one thing that's interesting about Pakenham is he's writing in the 70s, but he's not necessarily an imperial declinist. That was a popular movement in the 1960s. It's often associated with Corelli Barnett, Paul Kennedy, and so on, who sort of took a very depressing view of the British Empire as constantly on the brink of collapse, and it was quite negative. And what's interesting to me about Pakenham is he doesn't try and sugarcoat the failings of British governance and the British Empire, but at the same time, he rehabilitates figures, as you just mentioned, Redvers Buller, who is a villain in the wider historiography, whilst at the same time casting some, unflattering sidelines on Milner, on Chamberlain too, on other generals, Robertson, Baden-Powell come to mind. So he understands this, I think, and he has a sympathy for these characters and their backgrounds and the way they think, which can only come from growing up in that world. And I, I'd love to say I'm anything near that world, but I've occasionally brushed against it with tours or events. And you can see that there's even still a level of that thinking now, I think. And in the 1970s, when Pakenham's writing, this was so much more immediate.
Now, Spencer, could you explain for the listeners who were the Boers?
Well, I can, and it's a long story and a really fascinating one. But to give a short summary of it, the Boers were descendants from the Dutch colonists who had began to arrive in what is now Cape Colony, or the Cape, I should say, Cape Colony then, in Cape Town in the 1650s. And originally, the Dutch had founded what is now Cape Town as a revictualling port. So ships going to and from the East Indies could resupply here on their voyage to or from Europe. It grew, though. It grew from a fort and a provisioning station to a small settlement, and then to a settlement surrounded by farmlands, and then gradually, over the centuries, expanded further east. And it was an unusual settlement because the climate's pretty inhospitable. The local indigenous population was not entirely friendly, although was not strong enough to drive the colonists out. And compared to other Dutch holdings at the time, it struggled to attract immigration. So, really, by the time that by the turn of the 1800s, probably no more than about 40,000 white Dutch lived in South Africa. But because they were a small population, that gave them this unique identity. They began to change. Their language was not that of the Netherlands, and this was observable by the mid-1750s. The Boers in South Africa spoke a form of medieval Dutch, which to modern Dutch actually sounded really comical and odd, a bit like meeting somebody who speaks Shakespearean English now. And they also started to see themselves as different from their European counterparts. So as early as the 1700s, they were referring to themselves as Afrikaners, literally Africans, because that's where they live. Generations of them had been born and raised in Africa, in fact. And the name Boer is simply a Dutch word for farmer. Most of the South African Boer population were farmers. It was an agricultural society, and they were a difficult colony for the Dutch to rule. They're a long way from central power. They had this fierce identity. They had their own language quirks. They had their own legalistic quirks as well. They had their own religious quirks. And in the midst of all this, in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain decides to take control of South Africa to secure sea lanes. They don't want the French using it as a launch pad for invasion. There's a British invasion. The Boer garrison is defeated. And at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, South Africa is taken over entirely, or white South Africa, I should say, is taken over entirely by the British, along with this 40,000 or so Boer population. So they are the descendants of the original Dutch settlers. Incoming immigration had been pretty low throughout this period. So most of the Boers had been in South Africa for generations, which gave them this very, very strong national identity.
A couple of things about the Boers, like just reading recently, I've been rekindling my interest in the Boer War, but you talk about the numbers, 40,000, incredibly small figure. And even by the time of the Boer War, it's bigger, but well, first of all, it increased usually in the 19th century is the first thing. But the Boers concerned in the Boer War are not even all the Afrikaners in South Africa. They're a particular group, aren't they?
No, they're not. So there are a wide range of white settlers who end up in South Africa. The Boers are a catch-all group, a catch-all term for all Dutch speakers who are there, but they actually fall into their own ethnic and regional groups too. So there's a difference between Cape Boers, these are Boers who live in the Cape, compared to Boers who go on to live in Transvaal and Orange Free State, or even Natal as well, because the Boers do spread east. They undertake what's called the Great Trek to get away from British rule. They found their own small republics, but they scatter across what is now modern South Africa. And even within Boer society, there is a growing Boer aristocracy. These are often trace their ancestry right back to the first settlers. They own enormous areas of land, compared with the poorest members of Boer society, and forgive my pronunciation, any Afrikaans speakers, but it's the Bywoners, who are something equivalent to Appalachian mountain men. They are the poorest, absolutely the poorest of Boer society. They generally live in mountain areas. They're often bandits, and they are so crude and they are so poor that they're looked down on by other Boers. And then into the midst of all this, you also have what the Boers call Cape English, which is English-speaking settlers or Anglophone settlers. But that's not a very accurate term because, in fact, this can mean a wide variety of non-Dutch settlers. And then on top of this, you have Uitlanders. Uitlanders, outlanders, foreigners, which are non-Boers who are living in Boer nations in a Transvaal and Orange Free State, and they come from around the world. So you have this real mix and melting pot, and loyalties are strange. The Cape Boers who stayed behind are often more pro-British than the Boers who are in an independent country. The Uitlanders who've moved out, often looking for mining work, they're often quite pro-Boer, despite the British thinking, well, they'll all automatically be pro-British. And loyalties are very nebulous at this stage, especially outside the two Boer societies. So it's a complex society. And that's before we even get onto the Black African indigenous populations, which are another story entirely.
Well, something that you mentioned there earlier, Spencer, about the religious views of the Boers. I was watching one of your lectures on YouTube, that the views that they had and how that influenced their relationships then with the Black native South Africans. It seems to be like a very Old Testament, very strict Protestant, very extreme version of Christianity, even something that probably would have died out at that stage in Europe.
You're absolutely right. This is the religion of mid 1600s. So effectively the religion of the 30 Years' War. A very, very hardline form of Protestantism. It led Dutch armies through brutal wars in the 15 and 1600s, but it was also an almost apocalyptic Old Testament form of Christianity. And you're absolutely right. This type of religion had largely faded away in Europe, even by the 1700s, and for it to continue to exist right up till nearly the turn of the 20th century owes something to that uniquely close-knit identity that the Boers, especially in the Transvaal and Free State, had. And it was like nothing else. It bore no relationship to the Church of England, for example. It was a very, very apocalyptic, blood and thunder, built on the idea of guilt and the if failure came, it was because you were not good enough and God had punished you. It's a religion that is going to be very good in the mid 1600s when Protestantism is fighting for its survival. It seems an anomaly and an anachronism, even to observers, by the 1850s and certainly by the eve of the Boer War. It's a very, very unusual and distinct religion. You don't really find it anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be doing a lot of Irish analogies because it's the Irish History Show. I mean, one thing that does strike me as a possible parallel to the Boer religion and national identity is kind of Ulster Protestant identity, because, the Boers have a covenant, Dingaan's Day, where giving thanks to the Lord for having defeated Dingane, the Zulu king. And Ulster Protestants traditionally gave thanks for their deliverance in things like the 1641 rebellion and the Williamite Jacobite War. And there may be a parallel there.
I think there is, and perhaps, and I'm not a historian of religion, I hasten to add, but the idea that very close-knit societies adopt these forms and maintain these forms of religion, because as more and more outsiders enter a society, then you can have those ideas seem anachronistic, they might be diluted. And when you have relatively small, tight-knit, relatively stable populations, they actually, the opposite is true. Instead, they tend to amplify themselves and they become a shield, in fact, to separate one group from another group. And to put that into Boer terms, on the eve of the Boer War, one of the big features that is promoted by the Boer press is if the Boer states are absorbed or annexed by the British, one of the first things what will happen is religious freedom will be lost. And this is a big threat to a lot of Boers, the Boers, very religious society. So a lot of Boer propaganda, Boer propaganda is not as we think of it in the 20th century, but it does exist, is anchored on this. You must fight to defend not only your home, but your faith. Your faith is under threat. The British are coming here and they are going to dismantle your religion. And this is the religion we have had for centuries. It's the one true religion of South Africa. And so interesting comparisons, I think, to Northern Ireland as well.
Now, How did British control and British interests in South Africa develop throughout the 19th century, and how did that affect I was nearly going to say indigenous, but the Boer population that was living in South Africa?
It's one of those stories of a mission creep in certain ways. So when the British took over South Africa, or white South Africa, I should say, so the Cape in 1815, the British knew almost nothing about the Boer population. They were only really interested in Cape Town, the port. And Cape Town, what even then was a more cosmopolitan place, as port cities tend to be. The Boers who lived in the interior were almost a completely unknown quantity, and the British rather naively sort of saw them as, well, they're just Dutchmen who live in Africa. But as we've just established, they were not just Dutchmen who lived in Africa. They were very, very different religion, different legal systems, different language, and intensely independent. And they didn't care much for Dutch rule, and they definitely did not like British rule. And the British realized pretty quickly, well, we've got a problem because the Dutch are difficult, they're rebellious, they're slave owners. Not necessarily a disastrous problem, but as the mood music in the British Empire was changing towards abolition, that was going to be a problem. Legal system doesn't map properly with a British legal system. This is a real pain, and trying to sort of keep these wild men under control, as far as the British authorities saw, was a constant battle. In 1820, actually, the British government sponsored the first of a number of waves of British emigration to South Africa. First waves are actually Scottish, and the British government would pay you a little bit of money or give you a little bit of a stipend when you'd emigrate to South Africa and start a new life. Now, it's the 1820s. Conditions are very hard. Disease is rampant. A lot of these early settlers perish, but further waves will follow. The Dutch see this as a threat for reasons we were just discussing, John. New religion is coming, new people are coming with different language, immigration is threatening their way of life. That's a problem. There's problems on the frontier. The indigenous tribes are attacking and raiding the Boers. The Boers are expanding into indigenous tribes' lands, which is creating constant conflict. And the Boers are complaining all the time, why aren't the British helping us? And the British don't want to get involved. It's a long way away. It's expensive. It's a problem. It's all coming to a head. And the real final nail in the coffin is the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, because the Boers have always been a slave-owning society. Interestingly, the Dutch government has forbidden them from taking slaves from their immediate surrounding indigenous tribes, because they recognize that's going to create huge problems. Most of the Boer slaves are actually from Madagascar or from East Africa and imported, but it doesn't matter because the British say we're abolishing this anyway. And that's the final nail in the coffin, really. The Boers say, well, we're leaving. About 20,000, perhaps even more, Boers decide to make this great trek, which is almost like a biblical odyssey. It's almost like Noah in the Bible, in the way it's portrayed to the Boers. They head east looking for a new homeland. On the way, they run into another empire, the Zulu Empire, or the Zulu Kingdom. There's a bitter war between the two, which ultimately ends in a Boer victory. And then the Boers carve out two new states, Transvaal and Orange Free State, and say, we're going to live here. Now, the British weren't entirely sad to see the Boers leave. In fact, some British politicians around South Africa said, well, this is an advantage. We can import more Britons. Things will be better. But the way empires do, empires always expand. And so the British Empire expands across South Africa. It runs into the Zulus too. It reaches the Indian Ocean. War between the Zulus and the British ends with the British victory. There's a war between the British and the Boers, the First Boer War, which is really about independence. The Boers win that. Very small war, but the Boers win it. British say, okay, independence is guaranteed. But then just a few years later, the Boers strike gold and diamonds. And not just some gold and diamonds. This is the biggest diamond deposit in the world, and it is in Boer territory. And from that moment on, it's only a matter of time before the British are going to annex these two Boer republics. It doesn't matter what was agreed after the First Boer War. The presence of all that mineral wealth just across the border is, well, it's going to draw the gold bugs, that's for sure.
Well, this is the thing as well. It allows the Boers to portray this as a war of acquisition. This is just pure imperial greed. It's a war for diamonds and gold.
They do. And ultimately, and we can look at this in many different ways, we can play a little with counterfactuals. And the big counterfactual is, if the Boers had not discovered any gold and diamonds, if they had remained to poor agricultural societies, would the British have gone to war with them in 1899? And the answer is probably not. I think the British would have been content to wait to try and allow immigration to perhaps take its toll, who knows, or political pressure to slowly soften the Boers. It wouldn't have been urgent. But the presence of all that gold and all that mineral wealth not only tempts the British, but it also gives the British a fig leaf. And the fig leaf is the Uitlanders I mentioned earlier. So outsiders or foreigners who flood into Transvaal and Orange Free State, and they're looking to make their wealth. They want to work in the mines. They want to partake in the gold rush. They want to partake in the diamond rush. And thousands of these men appear in South Africa from all over the world. And the Boers are alarmed by this influx of new population, and so they forbid them the franchise. You have pretty limited rights as an Uitlander. And the British say, well, the Boers are restricting the rights of these noble Uitlanders and immigrants, and they yearn for freedom, they yearn for the franchise. And the Boers are worried about this. The Boers worry if they give the franchise to the Uitlanders, then the Uitlanders will vote out the Boers and a pro-British government will come in. So there is tension here, there's serious tension here. But the ultimate decider is the gold and the diamonds. And against a background, of course, of expanding empires, imperial rivalry, the scramble for Africa, and Transvaal and Orange Free State are unlucky to be right next to the British Empire with that gold and diamonds. But to be perfectly honest, if they'd been right next to the Germans, the Belgians, or the French, I think the same would have happened to them. That mineral wealth was too tempting for any European empire to pass.
From modern historiography, because of course we know in the end the history of South Africa becomes governed by, let's call them African nationalists for want of a better term, in the ANC and so on. So the Boer War is relegated to second place. But at the time, the two biggest powers are obviously the British and the Boers. But the question is, what about the African majority, though? What part did they play in this looming conflict?
It's a really interesting question. And the two primary African indigenous tribes who had the potential to be involved in this are the Xhosa and the Zulu. Now, the power of the Zulu kingdom has been broken by the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879, and then Britain tries to rule Zululand through a confederation. That's the wrong word, but they break up the kingdom. They put a number of chiefs in it, and they try and rule it as a multi-part kingdom. It doesn't work because the chiefs immediately go to war with each other, and very bloody Zulu civil war rages through the 1880s as they fight for control. But the Zulus are politically, by 1899, there's a certain degree of central power over them, including a certain degree of British influence. And the British are absolutely determined to keep the Zulus out of the war as much as they can, because if the Zulu nation mobilizes, they excuse the very modern phrase, and decides to intervene in the war, this is a huge incitement to the Boers, who see the Zulu more than the Xhosa. They see the Zulu as their racial, their ethnic, their cultural rival, which goes back right to when they encountered each other in the 1830s during the Great Trek. And so got to keep the Zulus out of the war. The Xhosa don't have, in the same way, a central power base. They do not have a single central kingdom. There are a variety of tribes scattered with the linguistic group. And by this stage, by the time of the war, there's thousands of them living throughout the Transvaal and Orange Free State, and indeed the rest of South Africa. But they're not centrally ruled except in a very local way. And they will be caught up in the war. And we can perhaps discuss that later. Tragically, without any great sort of say in it. It's interesting that the British don't want to make this a racial war. They're worried that's going to actually stiffen Boer resistance. They worry what European opinion will be like if photos or stories get out about African warriors butchering Boer civilians under British command. That's going to be very, very bad. In fact, they're so worried about the ethnic aspect of the war. The indigenous Indian army is not deployed in South Africa, even though it's available for deployment, because the idea of an Indian lancer charging down a Boer is racially very, very inflammatory in the context of 1899. The Boers, too, actually officially say we're not going to involve the Africans in any way, shape or form. In reality, both sides do. Both sides involve them. The Boers effectively have a forced labor force. Slaves, discuss, we can play with semantics with this, but they have a labor train of African workers who follow them and will build certain things for them. The British have a similar, although they at least pay their staff. both sides will use African trackers, guides, and scouts and interpreters. And in fact, the British, by the end of the war, will use thousands of Africans in uniform as trackers, guides, interpreters, even as auxiliary soldiers as well. So, although both sides are quite keen to portray this as a white man's war, and there's not a central involvement of indigenous African population, in fact, they're heavily involved from the very first moment.
Now let's talk about British politics, and perhaps we can bring in the Irish angle a bit here. But in terms of the party politics at the time, the Transvaal was abandoned, if you like, by Liberal government under Gladstone in 1881. So is it a kind of conservative war? Is it a party political thing? Like Liberals are not in favor, Conservatives are in favor. It's a conservative government at the time.
It's a great question because, of course, British politics is complex at this time. The Liberal Party is somewhat riven between your liberal unionists and liberals. The Conservative Party is broadly united, but has its own branches. So Tory democracy is not entirely dead. Tory Democrats, they're closely associated with Randolph Churchill, the father of Winston Churchill. There's branches there and so forth. You have the Irish nationalists, of course. You have the very first stirrings of the Labour Party are beginning to appear here. We can, though, in broad brushstrokes, we can say that it is a conservative war, that it is widely approved of by the Conservatives and their main constituent voters, and it is generally opposed by the other political parties. Now, the Liberal Party is not united initially in its opposition to war. There's definitely some Liberal politicians who hedge their bets, but the Liberals set themselves up very early on as we are the anti-war party. And as the war goes on and becomes more and more bitter, more of a PR disaster for Britain, the Liberals will sound that loud enough. And even in 1899, there's a sense that this is a bit of a grubby war. This is not a war against a crude or savaged foe by the language of the day, who are committing atrocities, who are raiding British settlements and butchering people. This is a war against Europeans by public opinion standards, who have states which have law and order, legal functions, the Christian religion and so on. Why is Britain attacking these nations? And although Britain does provoke the Boers to declare war first, nobody buys that. It's seen through immediately. Why is this the case? And the Conservatives spin the war, and I'm painting very broad brushstrokes here. The Conservatives spin the war as saying, well, this is necessary for the British Empire. The British Empire is expanding freedom to those hard-pressed Uitlanders. We've mentioned a number of times. It's securing the empire against rivals, especially France. It's a necessary step. The Liberals say we don't buy it. We think this is a war of aggression. And that's a word that's used, a phrase that's used a lot, a war of aggression. And in the British popular mind, Britain doesn't fight wars of aggression. The French do that. The Germans do that. But the British don't. The British are always defensive. They respond to provocations and they come and they establish law and order. And the Boer War is very difficult to sell in that way. So it is broadly. And any listeners who are really keen on 1890s politics, I apologize, I'm really simplifying this. It is broadly the Conservatives versus everybody else in this war.
Now, Spencer, can you describe what the military situation was regarding the Boer government? Like, how were they organized in terms of militias or a national army, for want of a better word? How well prepared were they for this fight?
In some ways, as well prepared as they could be, because the Boers didn't have a standing army. They'd never had a standing army. They had some militia units who wore uniforms and trained, but no more than a few hundred men, and really that was a social club rather than a serious military force. The only professional part of their army was the artillery. The state artillery, because artillery pieces are expensive, they require technical training. If you were a gunner in the Boer army, you were trained, or at least certainly at the start of the war you were trained. Later that fell through. And the state artillery was equipped with German and French guns. Our officers of that artillery actually trained in France or Germany. They went through artillery schools there and then came back to South Africa. But we're only talking a few hundred soldiers there. The remainder of the Boer military was a militia. And in times of crisis, the Boer government could call out all able-bodied men between 16 and 60. And that huge age range actually is a legacy of the very earliest periods of settlement when anybody who could handle a weapon would be needed to defend a settlement. And it had never changed. And the militia system had worked for the Boers for centuries. That militia system had defeated the Zulus. It had defeated the British in the First Boer War. And so the Boers felt no need to change it. The only real changes they'd made, in fact, for the Second Boer War was the Boers had purchased vast numbers of German Mauser rifles, imported them with ammunition, and could hand them out to volunteers as they arrived. Because part of the militia system was you were meant to arrive with your own firearm and your own horse, ideally 2 horses. Not everybody has them. When you arrived at your muster point, if you weren't well armed, got an old-fashioned gun and a bit of a nag, then the Boer government would give you a modern Mauser rifle, magazine loader, and they would give you a horse as well. Otherwise, you were untrained. You would go in your civilian clothes. You'd either go with your own gun or you'd be given a gun. In lieu of training, what the Boers did have was a tough frontier society. Not all the Boers lived on the frontier. There were urban Boers as well. But the Boers had this very, very frontier lifestyle. Even when you lived in a city, life was pretty tough in the city. These are rugged frontier towns. South Africa at this time, particularly eastern South Africa, is somewhat akin to the Wild West. There's banditry, there's shootouts, there's violence between indigenous and settled populations. It's a dangerous place to be. And for Boers, masculinity was very closely associated with rifles and firearms. You'd be given your first gun as a boy when you were between 12 or 14, usually a squirreling rifle, a very small caliber rifle. By the time you were old enough, by the time you were 16, you'd be given a genuine firearm and you were basically a man. And being good with a firearm, that made you somebody in Boer society. It was a means and a metaphor for masculinity. And if you're out on the frontier, you needed those guns. You hunted with them. You might defend your homestead. If you're in the city, being able to boast you're a good rifle shot, well, that made you more of a man. It was social capital to be a good shot. And the Boers had this marksmanship culture, this frontier culture, this defiant culture, really. So even though untrained, they were not inexperienced with riding horses or wielding firearms, and that gave them an unusual set of advantages relative to just calling out a raggedy-bottomed militia, as the British, I think, expected to find. In terms of numbers, that the Boers could call out about a maximum, on paper, about 60,000 men. In reality, maximum size the Boers would keep in the field at any one time, probably between 35 and 40,000. Not a huge force, but bear in mind, force densities in South Africa are quite low. So even in the vastness of South Africa, 40,000 men will soon disappear into the wilderness, and you'll have small groups here and there. But crucially, of course, the Boers knew this area. They were native to it. Even if you're a city Boer, you were better equipped to survive in African temperatures than if you're a new recruit from Glasgow or Birmingham or Manchester.
And can you speak a bit about the foreign volunteers with the Boers, including an Irish contingent among others, Major John McBride?
One of the interesting things, actually, when the Boers declare war is there's this expectation, and it's not a realistic one, but there is an expectation in parts of Britain that the Uitlanders we keep mentioning, they're going to rise up. They're going to rebel against the Boers. They're going to think the British are coming to give us the franchise. Can't wait. We're going to fight the Boers. Nothing like that happens. Pro-British Uitlanders tend to flee. They see the writings on the wall. They'll try and flee into British territory wisely. The majority of Uitlanders either sit on their hands and say, I'm going to wait to see what happens, or in fact, they choose to fight against the British. And there is a profusion of foreign volunteer commandos. And when we say foreign volunteer commandos, we tend to think of, legions of men coming from Europe. Now, men do come from Europe, men even come from the United States, but most of the foreign volunteer units actually form from Uitlanders in South Africa. And variety appear: the German commando, the Dutch commando, the Russian commando, the Italian commando. Later there's a French commando, which is made up quite heavily of exterior volunteers, and of course the Irish commando. We've had 2 Irish commandos, because you have probably the more famous one, which is the one that John McBride is associated with. He's actually second in command to an Irish American, John Blake, who's had an incredible life. He's been a West Point graduate. He's been an Indian Wars fighter in North America. He's become totally disillusioned with American governments, and he's ended up in South Africa. They form an Irish brigade. And there's also Arthur Lynch's second Irish brigade, which forms later. And perhaps as an indicator of the fractious nature of foreign commandos, Arthur Lynch forms his own Irish commando because he cannot get on with Blake and McBride. Just doesn't like them. And he wants to be in charge of his own unit. So two separate Irish brigades form. And the foreign volunteers, a really mixed bag and brave, no doubt about it. They could have sat out the war, perhaps naive. Some of them whipped up by ideas that it's going to be a very easy victory. Some of them motivated by anti-English feeling or desire for adventure and so on. They're going to fight very hard in the war. In terms of numbers within the wider Boer army, and I mentioned about the biggest the Boer army is going to get is about 40,000 men. The foreign volunteers probably no more than 5% of that, maybe 2,000 at their height. And confusingly, a lot of the foreign brigades pick up Boers as well, who aren't Irish or aren't German or aren't Dutch. They just happen to end up in these units. But the Boers make a huge show of this and say, look, we've got volunteers from everywhere. Look how great they are. Everyone's fighting the British Empire. The Boers call on people, come and fight the British Empire, join this fight against this evil empire. And of course, what's interesting is, in a way, in Britain, well, the French, of course, they're going to send a commando. The Germans they'll send one. The presence of an Irish brigade, and that stirs some tensions in Ireland as you can well imagine, as I'm sure you're well aware of.
Well, that's the thing, Spencer. Like, one of the things about the prominence of the Irish brigade, and particularly the attention that it gets in Ireland, is the worry that the authorities in Ireland have of how this will affect recruitment. You did a fantastic lecture and it's on YouTube. One of the things that's so interesting about your lecture is the way you describe it very well is that this war is a war of like different stages. But when we're talking about that initial stage, which we'll get onto shortly, there is a hope then for more recruitment towards the British Army, and that this growth of pro-Boer feeling in Ireland, that this might really affect enlistment for the British forces within Ireland. Have you noticed that when you were doing your research?
It's a really interesting question because the British authorities are not in the slightest worried about existing Irish units. In fact, there's some pretty defiant talk appears in British newspapers saying, we really hope the Munster Fusiliers end up in a firefight with the Irish Brigade. Then we'll see who's made of what. There's a sort of, if anything, a sort of belligerence about this that, well, our Irish units are staunchly loyal. They are going to smash these Irish volunteers. There's not going to be a contest. And there's a sort of, perverse intensity. You see it in letters pages in Britain in the 1890s, including in Ireland. And yet at the same time, the British authorities are also aware that there are ominous parallels between what seems to be happening in South Africa and the history of Ireland. You have a small, in population terms and in relative wealth, you have small nation, independent, agrarian, wants to mind its own business. It has a distinct religion. And then suddenly it's conquered and it's colonized by this incoming force. And the Boers aren't stupid. The Boers play on this imagery and say, we're being treated the same as Ireland was. When the Boers are trying to promote the Irish to be involved in this, they draw this direct comparison. There's protests in Ireland, in Dublin in particular. There's large crowds protest about the outbreak of the war. And so we see this sort of slightly interesting conundrum that parts of the British government are concerned about this. And of course, this is the height of tensions. The Irish question has not been answered. There's problems there. Lots of people are worried about it. They're worried about this. And yet there is a absolute certainty, well, our Irish units are completely loyal. They would never turn against us. And that's very, very interesting. And unlike the First World War, where there is a deep concern about Irish recruitment and conscription's never introduced in Ireland, for example, in the Boer War, you don't see that. But what you do see in the Boer War later on, because the conscription is never introduced in the Boer War, it's always fed by British volunteers, you can see a noticeable, if you map volunteering patterns, you can see noticeable drop-off in Ireland through 1901. Now, there's a wider drop-off across Britain in 1901 because the war's going badly, it's horrible out there. Who wants to volunteer for that? But volunteering in Ireland really starts to fall through 1901. This is the height of the concentration camp scandal. It's the war is going badly. Sense it might even be being lost. And if you map all the home nations at the time, you can see that there's a big drop off in Ireland and parts of Scotland. England pretty static. Wales drops a little, but Ireland really drops a lot, which suggests, a complex relationship. That there is an initial wave of Irish volunteerism, which is comparable to other nations in 1899 and 1900, but it drops off very quickly thereafter.
Obviously in Ireland, we talk a lot about nationalist reaction to the Boer War, and people like James Connolly, for example, one of the 1916 leaders, made his name campaigning against the Boer War. But something we should mention as well is Irish Unionist or Irish Loyalist reaction, because they do also get recruited into volunteer units, including a future Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, James Craig. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, where just to talk a little bit about volunteerism in particular, and where it comes from, and the origins of it, and complexities within it, particularly with the Unionists. There's a widespread acknowledgement that there's a certain tension here, and the comparisons, as I've just mentioned, between what's happening to the Boers and what happened to Ireland are too sharp not to notice. And so the idea from the Unionists is, or certain parts of the Unionist movement are, we will prove our loyalty. We will step forward. We'll be amongst the first to volunteer. And we'll show Unionists are to be trusted and therefore deserve protection and recognition by the British state. And that in turn can produce some volunteerism from Catholic Ireland as well, who say, well, we're just as loyal. We're going to show that we're ready to volunteer too. What's interesting too is that I think the British government is more open, and I am speculating a little bit here, listeners. I wouldn't necessarily be able to put you a written document proving this to you. I think the British government is more open to the idea of unionist volunteer units, yeomanry units in particular, which are part-time cavalry, really raised from landed areas and things. They're more open to that, whereas they prefer to push Catholic Irish volunteerism into existing units. Perhaps thinking, well, there's a system there. Thousands of Irishmen have passed through, the Royal Irish Rifles, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, name any British sort of unit of that era. Better to put them into those, but we'll take these unique unionist regiments as well. And that's interesting. I think that, again, I can't prove it. I can't find a document for that, but that's just my reading of that. So there is immediately a sort of difference in how this is done.
Yeah, I'm fascinating parallels with the First World War, of course, but time is short and we'll move on. But in terms of the military situation, so we spoke about the Boers. Is it fair to say that the British Army went into the war overconfident and underprepared?
I think that's the only way to put it. And there's a lot of strange factors at play here. On one hand, the British Army is tremendously good at imperial warfare. It's much better than any other army, and it has more experience than any other army. British Army has fought a war somewhere around the Empire for every year of Queen Victoria's reign, apart from 1862. So staggering battlefield experience. And it's interesting that if we think about Victorian military campaigns, we tend to think about disasters. We tend to think about Isandlwana, the butchering of a British column at the hands of the Zulus, or perhaps Maywand, where the Afghans destroyed a British brigade. The reason we think about those is they're incredibly rare. They just don't happen. For the vast majority of wars, Britain has conquered its opponents, sometimes with setbacks, but ultimately victorious. Curiously, the one anomaly here is the First Boer War, where the British Army has been defeated and then the Liberal government has decided not to pursue the war. And so you might think, well, the British Army should know better. They know what they're getting into. But there's an intelligence report produced before the war, and although parts of it are quite accurate, it understands certain aspects of Boer society quite well. It glosses over how tough the Boers are going to be, and it paints this picture. Well, the Boers are tough. They're good shots and they're good riders, but they're not as tough as they were 20 years ago, because men were harder 20 years ago. They were tougher 20 years ago. We can all be guilty of that. In my day, it was much tougher. Well, the intelligence report makes that case. And in fact, the Boers are much tougher than they were. There's more of them. They're better armed, and they've got more horses. So it's a much tougher proposition. But the British Army goes to war very, very relaxed about the prospect. And this is something I try and spread the word of. We've all heard the phrase, it'll be over by Christmas. And we say, well, it was associated with the First World War. It is associated with the First World War, though actually finding anybody who has written that phrase down in 1914, basically impossible. Where it is written down is before the Boer War, because the Boer War breaks out in October 1899, and a number of newspapers in Britain say it will be over by Christmas. The British Army is going to march all over these scruffy little farmers and show them what for. And I think the British Army believes its own hype. It thinks this is going to be pretty straightforward march to victory. And of course, they're completely wrong.
Well, that's what's so strange about this initial phase of the war, is that from the diplomatic side, it seems to be push the Boers into declaring war or taking the first step in getting the war started. But the British military seem to be completely unprepared in some aspects for the way that the Boers will fight the war. And what can only be said to be like really embarrassing defeats for the British Army at the hands of the Boers.
Completely. There's a number of problems right from the start. The British Army is very, very blasé about the dangers the Boers pose. They don't understand how mobile the Boers are. All the Boers are mounted. It's basically a force of mounted infantry. How much firepower the Boers can bring. They're all armed with magazine rifles. The British don't seem to understand climatic conditions in South Africa. And listeners, if you've been to South Africa, particularly out into the high veld, you know that the atmosphere is very strange. It really throws your distance vision if you're out there, if you're not acclimatized. British don't accommodate for that. Everything that can go wrong just about goes wrong in the early part of the war. The British are driven back into their garrisons. They're defeated repeatedly in the battle. Relief forces go out and all kinds of things go wrong there. They basically just smash into Boer defences. As one British journalist said, the campaigns to relieve the towns are nothing more than an honest, straightforward British march into a row of waiting rifles. There's so many mistakes are made. There's a lack of initiative, or when initiative is shown, it's shown wildly and it leads people into disasters. And this is an army going from fighting campaigns that are demanding against native opponents, but who are not armed with modern weapons, to suddenly fighting against an opponent with modern weaponry, with a high degree of military organization, despite a lack of training, who are fighting for national survival. And they're going to fight very, very hard. British just aren't prepared for that. And it leads to a string of defeats. And culminating in Black Week in December, 3 separate British armies, all defeated on their in their attempts to either relieve towns or take control of the area. Disasters all round. And this is the moment where if the Boers were going to win the war, get a peace settlement, it's December 1899, but it's not to be.
And now I wonder, well, first of all, Spencer, have you visited Dublin by any chance?
I have, but only once, and that was 3 years ago. So I'm due
Okay.
another visit.
Have you seen the Boer War Arch in Stephen's Green in Dublin?
I have, yes.
Yeah, and so on the arch, there's the names of battles like Talana, Colenso, Spienkop, and so on. And they're talking about the Irish Brigade and the British Army. So perhaps you could tell our listeners a little bit about the experiences of the much more numerous Irish fighting for the British than compared to the ones fighting for the Boers.
Absolutely. So one of the odd things about the British Army that goes to South Africa is it's decided that the existing brigade structure, which is just 1st Brigade, 2nd Brigade, and so on, that needs to be redistributed because what the British Army wants to go into action with, and what politicians like the idea of, is going into action with fancy brigades. So a Guards Brigade, a Light Brigade, an Irish Brigade. And again, I can't prove this, but I do wonder whether the insistence on an Irish brigade is a way of trying to sort of dampen down any enthusiasm for the Boer Irish Brigade, because the British Irish Brigade is numbers about 4,000. Combined Boer Irish Brigade, maybe 400 to 500. Numbers vary a little bit, so massively outnumbered. The problem with forming brigades like this, especially regional brigades like the Irish Brigade, the Guards Brigade's a bit different because the Guards draws units from all over the country. The Irish Brigade draws its troops primarily from Ireland. And tragically for the Irish Brigade, in the biggest battle of the war up until that point, the Battle of Colenso, the Irish Brigade is thrown into a frontal assault on a river crossing, which is always a very, very difficult position to storm. The entire battle goes to pieces. It's a total shambles for the British. The worst day of the war since the Napoleonic Wars for the Royal Artillery. They lose 10 guns captured, and that's absolutely disgraceful. A gun is the equivalent of a standard to the Royal Artillery. And the Irish Brigade assaults across the river, and it's a disaster. They're shot to pieces. Every single soldier who gets across the river is either killed or captured. Interestingly enough, the British Irish Brigade is attacking on the left, and I'm explaining this from the British perspective. We might say it's on the west side of the battle. The Boer Irish Brigade is on the east side of the battle, and they're not close enough to engage each other, but they are actually both on the battlefield at the same time, which is quite interesting.
Forgive the armchair generalship here, but again, I'm a big fan of Thomas Pakenham's book. And as I referred to before, Pakenham has great empathy for the defeated general here, so Revers Buller. Now, again, armchair generalship from a civilian, but there is, in that particular battle, Colenso, a big mountain overlooking the Boer positions on the British side of the river, which Buller declines to take. And it seems to me this symbolizes, the lack of almost professionalism, really, in the command in the first stage of the war.
Absolutely, it does. And so this is, and I'm going to mangle the pronunciation. I do apologize, but it's Hwangne or something like that. And it's this dominating peak that overlooks the entire Boer position. If you get onto that, you flank the entire Boer battle line, and it's going to be a crisis. The Boers know about it. They're worried about it. They just can't afford to put troops onto it because they'll be isolated. They're worried about being cut off. Not great. And Buller just ignores this because instead he just wants to go straight down the middle and batter his way through. And all the defeats the British have, we see these bizarre bull-headed decisions. And Reivers Buller, the Boers call him General Rubull, Red Bull, because he's red-faced and big, overweight man. That's his style. He's very much an up and at them. And he was, of course, castigated at the time, and he became a scapegoat that represented almost everything that went wrong with the army. Pakenham, of course, sets out to rehabilitate him. And Pakenham does make some good points that the campaign is very hard. The Boers are in good defence positions. They're tough fighters. They're not going to give in easily. And that Buller eventually does break through them. He works his way out. But again, I've never commanded troops in battle. Armchair generaling along with you here, John. You do have to look at this and go, well, these are some strange decisions here. And this isn't a case of the generals not knowing these things are here, because people are saying to him, well, we should do this. I think this is a good idea. And he ignores it. And Pakenham makes the excuse, well, it's harder to do than you think, which is true. The Boers would have fought for those positions. But is it worse than just trying to do a forced river assault, which is one of the hardest maneuvers in all of modern warfare? Discuss, as they say.
Yeah, and Pakenham makes the point that he eventually gets it right. But I mean, there's the Battle of Spion Kop, which is famous, among other things, for giving the name to the terrace in Anfield in Liverpool Football Club's ground. But the Battle of Spion Kop, a terribly bloody little battle, but the British had actually forced the retreat of the Boers. They just hadn't realised it. Then they left the position to the Boers. I mean, it seems extraordinary. Again, maybe the stuff you could get away with very badly armed opponents, you can't get away with against the Boers. But it does seem a very, very poor leadership, basically.
Absolutely. And Spion Kop, the bloodiest single day of the Boer War, a very haunting battlefield. If you're ever in that region and you're in the Rorkestrift region, it's a very easy drive to Spion Kop, well worth a visit. You're absolutely right. Both sides have battered each other into absolute submission, and the British have to withdraw. They've taken massive casualties. They're exhausted. The Boers withdraw because they've taken huge casualties and they're exhausted. But the Boers come back in the pre-dawn light, and they're amazed to find the British have gone. And so they reoccupy it instead. But the whole attack at Spion Kop is such a mess. There's so many mistakes. And it leads actually to, in early 1900, there's a huge purging of British generals and officers. So many of them get sacked because they're basically not up to the job. These are men who might have made very big reputations fighting against indigenous opponents armed with spears and bows and arrows and things. It's a different matter, as you say, John, fighting a Boer army that has rifles and artillery.
Now, Spencer, we might move on to the next phase of the war, when the British Army really starts to get its act together, and also the Boer response and their movement into guerrilla tactics.
So just to briefly bridge this, so that the initial attempts to relieve besieged towns are all defeated, but the British pour in reinforcements, including thousands of volunteers, the yeomanry, the militia, the volunteers, pour in. The British Army expands dramatically, perhaps 100,000 men in field by February 1900 against maybe 35,000 to 40,000 Boers. And the British just eventually roll through the Boer positions, and the Boer capitals are captured. The last really big pitched battle between British and Boer forces is in August 1900. And then after that, the Boers make a decision, and that's to scatter their forces, scatter them into individual fighting units, because they recognize we cannot fight pitched battles. And they make this decision, and those individual Boer units are called commandos. And in the Afrikaner language, doesn't have any great meaning. It's just the name for a unit. Of course, we know them in the English-speaking world, commandos are special forces. And that's because Winston Churchill chose that name in June 1940 when he formed the commandos as Britain's first formal special forces. And he deliberately took that name, partially because these commandos would fight the British Empire almost to exhaustion over the next few years because they broke into their individual groups. They could combine into larger groups. And commandos had no fixed size. You might have 50 men, you might have several hundred men, and you could divide or subdivide as you chose fit. You could combine into a larger force, you could subdivide. And what these men have, of course, is in the vastness of South Africa, these small units can disappear, they can raid with almost impunity because you can't cover everywhere at once. And the British are completely dependent on a relatively small number of rail lines. And the Boers can just keep blowing those up, derailing trains, attacking trains, and cause havoc. And the Boer strategy is just to fight the British Empire into utter exhaustion. And eventually the British will go, we cannot afford this war. It's a waste of time. And like all guerrilla wars, it's going to be protracted, it's going to be bloody, and it's going to be vicious, and it's going to blur the lines between civilian and combatant and really show those fault lines we talked about at the start of the podcast, the divided loyalties, the fact there is not a homogenous Boer. A Boer of the Western Cape is probably more loyal to the British than he is to the Boers who are fighting. There are Boers in Transvaal who don't want to fight anymore. They just want the war over. There are complex loyalties, there's complex interplay, and it leads to a really dreadful, vicious guerrilla conflict.
Yeah, so much to talk about here. Actually, I wish we had 3 hours, but you know, one of the things we spoke about, Spencer, when we were discussing doing this podcast, and one of the things you said was the conventional phase of the war, the phase of stand-up battles, can be seen as a gentleman's war, the last gentleman's war, but the guerrilla war was vicious and cruel. Can you talk about why that is?
Absolutely. So the idea of the gentleman's war is that unlike, say, fighting the Mahdists in Sudan or even the Zulus, who don't take prisoners, who will kill the captured, will kill the wounded, this is a war fought on European standards. Wounded men are treated, red flags are honoured, all this kind of thing. The last of the gentleman's wars, but there's nothing gentlemanly about the guerrilla phase because it has all the features of guerrilla war. You don't know, as a soldier, you don't know who the enemy is. The Boers wear civilian clothing. The Boer fighters wear civilian clothing. The Boers will take supplies. They will capture them from the British, but they'll also go and they will loot civilians. They prefer to loot Cape English, British civilians if they can, or Africans, black Africans. But if they can't find that, then they might just descend on some Boers. Boer villages or Boer farmsteads can be ransacked by the Boers, especially if they suspect you are not loyal. And there are atrocities here. Boer commandos murder and destroy Boer property. And the British don't really know how to deal with this. They don't have a model for this. This is the first really modern guerrilla war that Britain has fought. And so it poses a lot of problems. It poses a lot of threats. And so the British adopt a model that the Germans have actually used in the Franco-Prussian War. And this is a form of collective punishment. So when there's been an attack on the railway, the British will punish everybody within a 10-mile radius on the grounds of, well, somebody must have seen something. And if you haven't, well, you're probably in league with the enemy. It's like using a gigantic sledgehammer to crack a walnut. But the British have got no other way of doing it. And when that doesn't slow down the pace of Boer guerrilla operations, Lord Kitchener, victor of Sudan, he takes over and he says, well, we're going to burn everything. We're not just going to destroy around the strike sites. We're going to purge through scorched earth Boer civilian infrastructure, because once you've destroyed that, the Boers will have no supplies and they'll have nowhere to go. And that's going to create a catastrophic refugee crisis that eventually will be housed in the concentration camps in South Africa. And what we have is a war where all the lines are blurred, where loyalties are very shiftable, where cruelty to civilians from both sides becomes absolutely commonplace, and huge areas of northeastern South Africa are going to be completely devastated.
Just one more thing on that before, we delve into the wider thing about politics and also the camps. Like anyone who has studied guerrilla warfare, like historians of Ireland will have done, like you said, the lines between competent and non-competent and also rules of war get very blurred because it's difficult for regular soldiers to capture irregulars. When they do, they figure, well, why don't we just shoot them? There's no point. We can't get them otherwise. And so you see it in the Boer War as well, and you start to see people not taking prisoners on either side.
You do. And listeners, I'm sure you if you haven't seen it, please seek it out. The brilliant film Breaker Morant, which is about the most notorious incident of this. Breaker Morant's an Australian soldier with the Bushveld Carbineers. a Australian volunteer unit, and they are out in real bandit country in the high veld, far away from support. They're fighting Boer guerrillas. One of their most popular officers is killed in an ambush. There's controversy about it. Was there a white flag? Was it a treacherous incident? And the Bushveld Carbineers effectively go off the rails. They are, as can happen to any military unit in these circumstances, discipline begins to break down and they become openly murderous. And they don't just murder Boers that they capture fighting Boers, they murder civilians as well. Eventually, they're caught. Breaker-Morant is put on trial, and his defence in the trial is there is a standard rule that if we capture Boers, we shoot them. And in the film, they give this great shorthand, Rule 303. Sadly, Rule 303 is not a phrase you find contemporaneously, but it captures something. And Breaker-Morant is a vicious man. He's a vicious character. He is, by all standards, a war criminal. It's saying, well, everybody else is doing it does not excuse your own crimes. What is fascinating to me is about the same time, just before Breaker-Morant is arrested and he's going to be put on trial, Douglas Haig, future commander of the British Army, writes to his sister, Henrietta. And Douglas Haig is campaigning out in the Cape. There's Boer guerrillas operating there. And he writes to Henrietta and brutally tells her, and I forget the exact numbers, but it's something like, we captured 3 Boers the other day and they got captured British equipment on them, so we hanged them. And it's almost as if, and we went shopping. And so just at the time, the British are about to have a show trial of a man who is a murderer, no doubt, he is a criminal, for murdering Boers and indeed civilians. The future commander-in-chief of the British Army is writing home and going, yeah, we're hanging Boer prisoners. That's how vicious the war has become. It's a war that is increasingly fought without mercy on either side. And the high veld is a cruel place. It's you're far from civilization out there. You're far from law and order. You can get away with things because there's nobody there to see you. And that's the sort of horrible reality of the guerrilla phase.
Well, what effect did what was happening then in South Africa at the time have on public opinion in the UK and particularly in Ireland? Things like the concentration camps, things like the attacks on civilians or the sufferings of civilians.
More than anything else, it's the exposure of concentration camps that changes the mood. Volunteerism is drying up by 1901. The glory days are over. People are willing to volunteer to go and fight pitched battles and be part of a glorious war. People aren't really wanting to volunteer to go and fight in a guerrilla war where it's going to be 99% boredom and 1% abject terror. Recruitment dries up. The British Army relies increasingly on really quite second-rate troops to try and do the job. Popularity of the war is going, but the British government is quite keen to say, well, the war's over. It's what we now call a policing operation and play down the violence of the guerrilla war and say, well, actually, nothing that much is happening. We're chasing the Boers. And they introduce the prisoner count, which is something akin to the body count of Vietnam. And it's this meaningless statistic that's given out in the newspapers in Britain saying we've captured 397 Boer prisoners. In reality, these sweeps are just catching anybody who happens to be in the area. And the vast majority of them aren't Boer fighters. They just happen to be people farming or traveling. And most of them end up being let go because they haven't done anything. In terms of British setbacks, these aren't really reported on. The news is kept quiet. But what changes it is Emily Hobhouse. And she originally goes out to really be a volunteer aid worker. She wants to try and help particularly Boer women who might be in trouble. But in her travels, she discovers the concentration camps. And a little bit of an explanation about concentration camps, because they're very much a misunderstood feature. The very first concentration camp that is formed is actually to protect surrendered Boers from reprisals from Boer guerrillas, which I think emphasizes the complexity. Boer surrendered fighters who've gone home actually ask for help from the British government and say, we're worried we're going to be murdered by roving guerrillas. Can you house us? Can you protect us? But then, particularly once Kitchener has introduced his scorched earth policy, you have tens of thousands of women, children, and elderly. They've got nowhere to go. You can't just leave them out in the wilderness, they'll die. And so instead, they're herded into these camps. And these camps are overcrowded. They are incredibly poorly run. The lack of knowledge in how to run these camps is awful. They're not, though, intended to kill and maim and mutilate. They are not the concentration camps of the Second World War. And Interestingly enough, one of the reasons you hear this phrase, well, the British invented the concentration camp, that actually comes from Nazi propaganda. In the late 30s, the Nazis mount a quite effective propaganda campaign to defend their own concentration camps. And they do it by contrasting them against the concentration camps of the Boer War and saying, well, tens of thousands died in these camps. They were awful. They were terrible. The British murdered people in there. Our camps aren't like this. And that's actually quite a powerful message in Europe in the 1930s and into the 40s. And the Nazis even make a propaganda film about it called Kruger, which is Uncle Kruger, which is a black and white film. It's an anti-British film about atrocities in the Boer War. But to go back to the camps in South Africa, they are a humanitarian disaster waiting to happen. They're overcrowded, they're unsanitary. You've brought tens of thousands of people together. Disease outbreaks are inevitable and they occur. And Emily Hobhouse investigates this. And most importantly of all, she has a camera and she takes photos, because if it had just been the written word, people would have denied it. But she has appalling photographs of starving, diseased children. And she gets her story out, it gets into the press, it explodes, and it is a global scandal. It's absolutely huge. And the British government cannot deny this anymore. They cannot deny it. The evidence is square in their face. And this unites the Liberals and all the anti-war parties. And there's this famously fiery speech because the Conservative government has said there is not a war being fought in South Africa. The war is over. This guerrilla war, it's just bandits. And famously, the leader of the Liberal Party says, when is a war not a war? When it is carried out by methods of barbarism in South Africa. And that's a direct attack on the British government. And that's when you see a big mood change in Britain, in wider Europe as well, because this is not a glorious war. This is women, children, and the elderly dying in large numbers, and seemingly due to not necessarily British cruelty, British indifference. And that's a very devastating message.
Yeah, I mean, so much about that again, but like again in Pakenham's book, and apologies to listeners who haven't read Thomas Pakenham, but he says that Kitchener, who was the commander in chief by this point, says that it's not that he wanted to wipe out the Boer women and children, he just didn't care. He just wanted to get the war over as quickly as possible, remove the civilian population from a position to supply the guerrillas. And Kitchener's like, well, I killed 10,000 Sudanese in one day at Omdurman. That war is hell, you know?
Mm. And that is Kitchener in a nutshell. Kitchener's, some of his biographers speculated he got psychopathic tendencies. He certainly doesn't feel any great moral weight. And his view is this is the only way we're going to win the war. We could be fighting these guerrillas for 15 years. If we have to herd in and, by extension, see the deaths of 20,000 civilians, it's a price worth paying because the war will end. And it's a brutal way of looking at it. It's divorced from any kind of morality, but that is how Kitchener sees it. And his view is the concentration camps aren't my problem. My problem is defeating the guerrillas. And I'm defeating them by destroying Boer civilian infrastructure. The fact there's death and disease and horror in the camps, that's a civilian problem. Whereas the civilians go, well, it's an army problem. They should help us. And the whole thing is a disaster. One thing that is interesting, and I think this perhaps puts... It's hard to say, put a nuance on a series of camps that kill over 20,000 people, but adds again complexity to the question is, after Hobhouse breaks her story, she's then kept away from South Africa. Kitchener says, do not let that woman in this country. There is the Women's Commission goes over to investigate. They make various recommendations and so on. And one of them is there shouldn't be any more women and children put in these camps. And it's ambiguously phrased. What the commission probably means is, find somewhere else to go with them. Well, Kitchener interprets it literally, and he says, okay, we're going to continue torching farms and villages, and we're just going to leave the women and children out there and let the Boer guerrillas sort it out. And a number of Boer guerrilla leaders actually reflect after the war that that's a devastating blow for them. And perhaps as many as 10,000 Boer civilians are with the guerrilla forces at the very end of the war. And the guerrilla forces can't care for them. They're out in the wilderness. Women and children are suffering terribly. There's even cases where Boer commandos go up to the gates of a concentration camp and drop off civilians and leave. Because at least in the camps, although it's grim, there's medical treatment, there's food, there's shelter. And some Boer leaders say that the fact that Kitchener forces us to take these civilians instead is what turns the tide of the war. So these are all the complexities of it and the horrors of it, to be honest, because the guerrilla phase is a dreadful phase of the war.
Well, how does the war actually end, and what is the final resolution?
The bottom resolution is that the last of the Boers are exhausted by really, we would call it spring in the Northern Hemisphere. It's autumn in the Southern Hemisphere. So early 1902. The fact that they're having to shelter 10,000 civilians across the fighting area is difficult. Their own numbers are dwindling through death, disease. Men just give up, they desert. The British Army is strong. In fact, by this stage, there are more Boers fighting for the British in an organisation called the National Scouts. Perhaps 15,000 Boers in the National Scouts compared to maybe 10,000 active guerrillas. So there are more Boers in British uniform trying to end the war for the British. Fascinating wrinkles to this conflict. And what's left of the Boer military is finding its mobility constrained. Kitchener has ordered the construction of 8,000 blockhouses, these small bunkers, very easy to erect, all along the railway lines, which make it very difficult for the Boers to attack the railways or even cross them. That's a problem. The Boers are running out of food. They're being pressed back into ever decreasing areas of the country. They're just exhausted. And there's a worry amongst the Boer leaders that if it goes on like this, then basically nothing will be left. They'll all die. They'll all be wiped out. And then there'll be nothing left to even salvage from this. And so they open peace negotiations with the British. And the British, I won't say offer a lenient peace, but it's not as heavy as the Boers fear. And obviously there's a loss of national independence. Transvaal and Free State will be brought into South Africa. But otherwise, it's relatively moderate. There's going to be amnesty, basically, if you fought against the British. There's going to be there's a promise of reconstruction money, although that's nowhere near enough to repair the damage. The only thing the Boers really object to is there is a line in there as well about black citizenship. Black Africans are going to be elevated, and previously they've been absolutely third-class citizens in Afrikaner society. British say we're getting rid of that. We're going to make them not exactly equal, but we're definitely going to improve their standing. And the Boers say we'll accept everything except that. Kitchener says no problem, crosses that out, brings everybody to the table. Peace treaty is signed in May 1902. But actually crossing out that law that's going to improve the status of black Africans is going to, in the long term, have huge consequences. But that's a story for another day. And so the war ends in May 1902. Huge areas of South Africa devastated. Somewhere in the region of 27,000 Boer civilians have died. Probably about the same number of black African civilians. 9,000 Boer fighters are dead or have become casualties. British Army suffered 22,000 dead, perhaps as many as 100,000 killed, wounded or sick. Really heavy losses, and northern South Africa is just a wilderness. It's just been burned down, and it's going to take years to repair it and millions of pounds as well. So a war that was meant to be over by Christmas in October 1899 has actually lasted nearly 2.5 years. And I think it's testament to, one, what a vicious war it is, but also how important this war is to not only South Africa, but the wider world as well.
Well, to paraphrase the title of one of your books, how does the Boer War lead to tactical reforms within the British Army leading up to what we have then at the start of the First World War?
Well, there's an entire book on it, and condense that into 80,000 words, but condense it into a few minutes for your listeners. The army comes out of the war and it takes ferocious criticism at a government level because the government blames the army and says, well, what happened? Why did you make such a hash of this? And the army is embarrassed. It's horrified. There's worries about, well, if we can't defeat a group of farmers in South Africa, what hope if we clash with France or Russia or Germany? We're not ready. And so there is the biggest peacetime reform of the British Army that it's had in peacetime right up until the present day. You can go back 125 years. You won't find a peacetime reform as intense as this because the army is so conscious about how many things have gone wrong and it's determined to try and improve and change. And it gets a lot of things right. The army that's going to go to war in 1914 is much more tactically flexible, better trained, better led, better equipped than the army that went to war in 1899. And it's not perfect. No army is. There's going to be terrible fighting in the First World War, a vicious learning curve. But it's interesting that the doctrine that the British Army adopts in the aftermath of the Boer War is called Field Service Regulations, first issued in 1909. The British Army will be using Field Service Regulations right up until the late 1940s. So those regulations, with improvements as technology changes, regulations that were born from the Boer War will lead the British Army through the First and the Second World Wars. And I think that's testament to how much the British Army changes. It goes from a slightly doddering Victorian army, which is very good at what it does, but has a lot of weaknesses, to a modern army that is going to fight and ultimately be victorious, terrible losses notwithstanding, in 2 world wars. And that's the true tactical legacy of the Boer War. And as one veteran after the First World War remembered, that Paul Kruger, the president of the Transvaal, who actually declared war on Britain at the start of the conflict, was the best friend the British Army ever had. And interesting epitaph. I don't think Paul Kruger would have appreciated that epitaph, but an interesting one nonetheless.
Now, Spencer, we've taken up an incredible amount of your time. You've been very generous with us, but I want to squeeze in 2 more questions if I can. So the first one is about South Africa, and again, a huge question, but what's the legacy of the Boer War for South Africa?
It's a huge question, and I think it's changing as well, because as demographics change in South Africa, the importance of the Boer War declines. The Boer War is a pivotal event for South African history. But from a Black African perspective, not much changes, because the British do not insist on an improvement to Black citizens' rights. Really, the situation is unchanged. From an Afrikaner perspective, the Boer War is often seen as the beginning of a really dangerous period, because so many Boers die in this war, particularly women and children. There's a demographic problem in South Africa. One thing that makes the demographic problem less than the Boers fear is the British hope there's going to be a lot of immigration from Britain into South Africa, and they actually encourage soldiers to settle in South Africa post-war. And most soldiers who've done a tour of South Africa say, no way, I cannot wait to go home. It's been horrible out here. I want to go home. So there isn't this wave of immigration. But the Boers see this as a terrible moment for them historically, that their numbers fell, that their society was not irreparably damaged, but was seriously damaged. And so the legacy of the Boer War becomes very, very important for Afrikaner nationalism. And I still get hate mail from time to time from modern Afrikaner nationalists who say I'm a British apologist and rant at me through the email and things. And Afrikaner nationalism will thrive on the idea that the British were so cruel to Afrikaners and deliberately tried to eradicate them. This becomes a fundamental myth of Afrikaner nationalism, that the British tried to slaughter and massacre the Boers, and they failed, and the Boers have recovered, and they must fight on, of course. That's a very simple answer. There's a lot more to it, but that's what it means. And of course, as the Afrikaner population declines and declines, and of course we've had ANC rule now in South Africa for coming up for 30 years, political situation is very, very different, that the importance of the Boer has faded, but it is still critically important to the Afrikaners. And it's going to lead not through a straight line. It's going to be a wiggling line with opportunities missed, perhaps. It's eventually going to lead to apartheid in the 1940s. And a complex story, and the Boer War seen as basically an unmitigated disaster for the Afrikaner nation, and by extension, possibly South Africa as a whole. And perhaps this is what has led to South Africa, the Boer War, really falling from historical view. We were talking before the show started. There are so few academics who work on the Boer War now. I can think of myself and one other. Forgive me if listeners, if you happen to be one of them, I'm really sorry, but it's just not a subject that is popular anymore, which is a shame, because it is, as I hope I've shown you, so important.
Yeah, and in Ireland, just returning briefly to our little corner of the world, it actually has a massive cultural impact on Irish nationalism. Like, you see Irish or IRA guerrilla fighters of the 1920s, half of them seem to have the nickname Kruger, for example. And they even modeled their uniform, when they had a uniform, after the Boer wear in South Africa. Like, they had a wide brimmed hat that was pinned up at the side and the bandoliers across the chest and stuff like that. So in the short term, it had a massive cultural impact on Irish nationalism. Now, I wonder, in terms of British politics, did it have a long-term impact?
In British politics, it does, and it leads to the most obviously, it contributes heavily to a crushing Conservative defeat in 1906, when the Liberals finally are a unified party and they sweep the Conservatives out in one of the heaviest defeats. And I think it's the second heaviest defeat the Conservatives have in the 20th century. And that leads Britain into a very different political direction. The Liberals are much more left-leaning than the Conservatives. And the Boer War is not the only factor that leads to the Conservative defeat, but it is a major factor. And the legacy there is absolutely is huge. It weighs down on the Conservatives. It troubles the Conservatives really until the 1920s when they come back into power as a single party, not a coalition. It also leads to changes in certain aspects of how Britain views war, how Britain views military service. Part of the agitation for a better deal for working class people in 1906 is driven in part by this idea of national efficiency, which is this very broad church of groups who say, well, life in Britain is very tough, life expectancy is poor, health is poor, our citizens are small and weedy. And that had been really noticed in the Boer War, that the standards of physical fitness of recruits were appalling. And in fact, the British Army reduced its height requirement from a minimum of 5'3" to a mere 5 foot. It's the smallest British army that fights in the modern era, because there's so many small, stunted inner city men were trying to volunteer. And so national efficiency is this broad church. It's got everything from fringe characters who are basically into eugenics to really dedicated Quakers who want to see a better deal. But they're all, for various reasons, agitating, saying we need to make the working class happier and healthier, not out of altruistic reasons, but so we can fight a major war. And that is a big feature in the Liberal social programme, with the introduction of pensions, a certain degree of unemployment benefits, certain degree of subsidised healthcare. And you don't get that, I don't think, if you don't have the Boer War. And that just fascinates me. It's a war that changes everything for Britain.
Well, Spencer, thank you so much for doing this interview. As John said, we could really speak for another 3 hours, really abuse your hospitality. But thank you very, very much. And we have to remind everybody to check out your excellent podcast, Not So Quiet on the Western Front. That was Dr. Spencer Jones. And as I said, there's some of his lectures on the Boer War are up on YouTube, and they are really, really fascinating. So if you want to check out this or any previous episodes of the show, you can visit our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. And we always really appreciate when people share episodes of the show on your social media. And you can also follow us on Twitter at Irish History Pod, or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. So on behalf of myself, Cathal Brennan, and my co-host, John Dorney, thank you very, very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.